Hi, thanks for tuning in. This is the ASX and Sectors weekly chart analysis for the week ending 6th of February 2026. First chart is the S&P ASX 200 index, the XJO. This is the parent index for the Australian Stock Exchange. You can see the market closed lower this week. There was quite a sell-off on Friday. That left price really pushing lower in an attempt to find sufficient buyers for the sellers at the time. Our local market is one of the leaders as far as time zones go, and following a sell-off on overseas markets, our market was leading to some extent the rest of the world. And if it's uncertain as to the outcome of a sell-off overseas, our market will often get ahead of the supply that's drawn out, and perhaps it's better to overreact than underreact. You don't really want to be chasing weakness in the market. So our market generally will overreact and push lower than you might expect otherwise. Because it's relatively easy to recover lost ground, but if you get behind ongoing weakness, it's really hard to catch up to that weakness. So we generally, in times like this, overreact. You just have to accept that and go along with it. And sometimes it's used to the advantage of the larger players in the market. But this week, price really stretched lower, especially on Friday. There was really insufficient buyers in the market to satisfy the sellers, and that forces price to really stretch lower in order to seek out and find sufficient buyers to absorb the supply from the sellers. And you see the market really stretch lower like this when that happens in the market. Volume was well above the average. It was increased and above the average. And that really matches pretty well with this week's spread. So there's no anomalies in there. I would expect the market will attempt to consolidate either at this level or just below it at this level. A recovery would see price come up to here and attempt to move back above this level. So we'll see how that goes. But I expect the market will probably attempt to just find some support in here, at least to start with next week, and then respond from there depending on what happens on overseas markets and how much supply continues to be drawn out of our market. Next chart is the mid-cap sector, and this market did close slightly below the lows of the range through here. So you would say this market is threatening to break down. That would suggest to me that it was a little bit of an overreaction. There just wasn't enough demand in the market to satisfy the sellers in the market at the time, particularly on Friday, and that caused the market to overshoot its level. And I would expect this market to make a pretty good attempt, recover back to this level in here. If price was to continue lower, you'd probably see the market move back here. But I would expect the market to make some sort of attempt at least to recover back to the lows of the range, and that's in here. The small ordinaries sector is always a little more volatile than the parent index, and price did move considerably lower on the weakness on Friday. It didn't break below the lows of its range, and it's kind of hanging a little bit, which does show you that the market didn't close at a logical level. And when that happens, it's either overreacted or underreacted, and it will either recover or continue lower. And this isn't a new level being established most times. The volume wasn't particularly high. It was above the average, but it doesn't match very well with how wide the spread is. And volume and spread really go hand in hand. So I would suggest this is probably an overreaction to some degree, and you'll see the market attempt to recover in response, at least somewhat. This is the ASX financial sector. Lows of the range through here, highs of the range up here. breakdown line in between. And you can see the market this week, it's closed higher for the week and it's pushed up to the breakdown line and it's just closed slightly below it. So that was a pretty good job for the week on increased and slightly above average volume. So that was genuine trading. It probably suggests that there's been consolidation and or some accumulation in this sideways zone. And it leaves the door open for an attempt to break above the breakdown line at some point, perhaps next week, and attempt to recover back into this zone to the left here. There'll be supply up there, which it will need to absorb to recover back above the breakdown line. That's always a difficult situation to deal with. But back here, while the price has been trading sideways in consolidation mode, some of the supply that was residing above will probably have sold out at a loss and won't be there anymore. It would have been absorbed down here. So there's some chance the market will be able to recover. It's showing some intent as though it would like to recover. The last 4 bars have been trading in a consolidation and absorption pattern and perhaps an accumulation as well in there. If that's the case, the market will likely attempt to make a recovery at some point, probably next week. The ASX metals and mining subsector, and this market really sliced lower this week. There was some weakness up here. There was at least inferred. The next lower level comes through there. The market pulled back with an increased spread, slightly increased and above average volume, but the spread was perhaps a little wider than the volume suggests. And in that case, this market has possibly overreacted to some degree. You may find an attempt to recover next week. If price continues to show weakness, it will likely come back to this level. The ASX gold sector also pushed lower this week. Supply was drawn out last week. Up here, prices pulled back in response. The next level was through there, and prices pushed below that. The lows of that level come through here. Bit of an awkward bar, that. So there should be some form of support in the background here in that little zone there. And the market's pulled back into that zone this week on increased spread and increased volume. So the price has really accelerated lower here. I would expect the market to make a serious attempt to consolidate and recover in this level here, in this zone. The ASX energy sector just pulled back a little this week. It did, however, trade within the range of the previous up bar pretty much for the whole week. And price has traded in this zone here. It hasn't broken down. It's done a pretty good job to hold on and attempt to consolidate and absorb supply within the range of this up bar. It's a pretty good effort in what was a weak market. I expect the market will attempt to hold on to this low here. If supply becomes overwhelming, it'll have to break down. But I expect the market to make a pretty serious attempt to hold on at the lows of the range here. This is the healthcare sector. We've seen some ongoing attempts to support this market. Lows of the range through here. You'll note that the lows weren't broken this week. Price held on at this level. Volume did increase quite a bit. So the market did a pretty good job to hold on there. I think the market is attempting to consolidate and absorb supply and possibly accumulate here. And I'm starting to wonder if this whole period here is actually one consolidation and accumulation pattern. We'll just have to wait and see. I've been treating it as 2 individual patterns where price broke down. It hardly broke down at all. The thrust lower shortened considerably from here to here and then here to here. I'm thinking this may be one overall pattern rather than 2 individual patterns. It's yet to be proven that way, but I think the market is attempting to consolidate and perhaps accumulate at this level. The ASX industrial sector had been attempting to consolidate within the range of this up bar here. Been trading within that range for quite some time now and doing a pretty good job, really. It looked like it might have been consolidating through there. Lows of the range come through here, highs of the range up here, and the market is threatening to break down. Now, volume was really only about average, and spreads increased and closed below the lows of the range. That would suggest an overreaction. It's overshot its lows to some degree, and I would expect a pretty good attempt to recover back to this level. That remains to be seen whether it does or not, and it will depend on how the overseas markets will trade early next week and how much supply is drawn out of this market. But I do expect an attempt to recover back to the lows of the range. This is the consumer staples sector. Lows of the range through here, highs of the range through here. Next level above begins there. That's the breakdown line. You can see the market's attempted to push higher this week and it's failed. Supply's been drawn out and it's pushed back within this sideways range where it's been trading for some time now. Volume increased, but it wasn't really strong volume. It was just slightly above the average. That suggests that demand was low and supply was overwhelming that demand, and that forced the poor close down closer to its low for the week than its high for the week. Consumer discretionary has held on barely at the lows of the range, comes through here. Slight overshoot of the lows on an increase in volume. I do expect this market has potentially overshot its lows, it's overreacted somewhat to the weakness on Friday, and it will attempt to recover back to this level. It also remains to be seen, but I suggest that it will probably attempt to do so. And once again, it will depend to some degree on how the markets overseas are trading and how much supply is drawn out of this market. But I do expect some sort of attempt to recover back to this level. The ASX property sector closed lower this week. It's closed well below the lows of the range. Breakdown line, highs of the range. This probably does suggest the market's broken down. There could actually be a reversal like this. I'm not sure that it will reverse. We'll have to wait and see. But at this point, the market does look like it's broken down. There may be an attempt to recover. At this point, that attempt would be less likely to succeed, would probably break down from there. It'll be worth watching for sure to see if it can recover and reverse. I'm feeling less confident considering how far below the lows of the range the market has pushed this week that it will be able to recover. Volume was increased, but only slightly above the average. The spread was quite wide. So that suggests there was an overreaction, but that's a pretty serious overreaction. You generally only see a slight overreaction in these cases. This is pushed clearly below the lows of the range, and it would suggest to me the market will find it difficult to recover. More likely, it'll recover back to the lows of the range and then fail again and then break down. We'll just follow it and see how it goes. Back to the parent index just quickly. You can see the market has pushed clearly lower this week on an increase in volume. You've got the important levels coming through like this. Prices closed here this week. I expect an attempt to consolidate in this zone here. It will depend to a large degree on how the overseas markets trade early next week and how much supply continues to be drawn out. If the market really does push lower, this is the level below, more likely the market will attempt to consolidate in here, and then if supply is relatively low or not overwhelming, an attempt to recover back to this level is probably quite likely. Okay, thanks for your time. I'll be back again next week. See ya.